Okay, well, we're going to do a little test drawing here today. I'm going to kind of show you a little bit about the Spaceship-a-day, and I've got a 2H pencil. I'll show you one of the two ways that I usually start one of these. The other would be with a 20% gray marker, which I will show later in another video. Now what I'm doing here is laying down a basic perspective grid just to sort of get an idea of where things should be. Now, I'm not a huge stickler on perspective, and I'm not going to teach you in this video how to do perspective, other than to say that I'm using effectively a two-point system. There's a vanishing point to the right and a vanishing point to the left. That is off the page, and as you can see, I'm not actually using a ruler to establish these. I'm just freehanding it, and some of these lines might not actually work out well, and I will effectively ignore them. The trick is to just kind of keep your hand moving and get some grids in place that are close to the mark. The closer the better. That way, when you start adding in details, they won't go off in an unusual manner. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is establish a center line for the ship. It doesn't really matter which shape the ship is going to be here. I just want to make sure I know where my center point is, because that'll come into play as we establish left and right symmetry for some of the design details. In this particular case, I am going to start with about the middle of the ship. I have an idea in mind of something that has two wings off the back carrying a couple of large guns. This will be some kind of a snub fighter, so I'm going to establish where these wings are going to be, and if you kind of eyeball the distance from left to right, you can get a good idea of where the left and right of the wings are, and I'm establishing it in a plane. Even though I'm not going to do a rectangle here, at least I have a good sense of what that shape is actually going to be once I'm in place there. And if you notice, since I did actually follow some of the lines I established earlier, that they're reasonably within range of the perspective. So let's drop a couple of guns off this. And in my mind, I'm kind of, I might linger around the details here, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to go with something that's pretty familiar. So these are going to look remarkably like X-Wing fighter guns. Not terribly creative, but at least it kind of gives you some idea where to put them. And if any of you are very detail oriented, you'll remember that X-Wing fighters have basically this big bulky cylinder with details followed by a gigantic, ridiculously gigantic barrel coming out of the front, and then that sort of iconic little half circle bit here. Now I have this one coming out this far, so I have to establish the distance on the other one. I have sort of a line of where it needs to go, but you want the ends to meet up, so I'm going to just sort of follow my perspective line that I'd generally etched in, make a new one as you need to, and then I can kind of see that it'll basically fall right about there, and notch that in. Same thing with the little half circle detail here. We'll get that in there, and at this point I'm not lingering too much on the actual details themselves, although you certainly can afford to do so. Now, I think big rectangular wings are kind of silly, so I'm going to chop these off right here, chop the corners, and you can see that I kind of have I'm going to establish where the chop is here. If you don't get these two distances right, then it'll look a little wonky, and the angle will be off. This might not be perfect, but at least it kind of gets the job done. And where these meet in the middle, there's going to be kind of a middle trough of details here that I'm going to establish. So I'm going to put in that trough and sink this down in a little bit. Now it's starting to, in my mind, look like an old Klingon design from the FASA game, Star Trek games from the 80s and 90s, D7. So I will just go ahead and follow that vibe right here and turn it into sort of a cross-platform fighter of some sort. And bringing this guy down. Now we've dropped beneath the center line, and that's where we're going to end up putting the cockpit module out here in something like a boom of some sort or another. Maybe this is a I'm just describing now sort of a conical shape, maybe a fat X-Wing fighter to complete the bastardization process of the whole thing. And now that I kind of have a sense of what this thing is going to be shape-wise, maybe I take a second here, and if I don't like it so much, I'm not really fond of this little dip in here. I think the shapes in here are going okay. This could be some sort of income derivative of the X-Wing fighter, something a little more snubby than their snub fighters, but I'm kind of thinking under here, I want to turn these into some kind of an engine duct, and this is where we get into one of the other complexities, the ellipses. So if I wanted to drop in a cylindrical engine of some sort, the same kind that you would have on an X-Wing, should just be drawing an X-Wing, but that's okay. I like the idea of sort of deriving this and complete this off the back with some sort of engine nozzle off the back here. And I am going fairly quickly. I always end up putting cylindrical turkey feathers on all my engines. Turkey feathers are the term for the little vanes that control a thrust nozzle on the back of a jet. So of course spaceships have jets, contemporary 20th and 21st century jet engines. There we go. Now I'm looking at it, it's kind of feeling a little wonky, but you know what? It's within bounds. I think that this wing could have come out a little further, maybe out to here a bit, so I might correct that now. And notice I'm not erasing. I will save erasing for after. I mean, if there's something really bad, I'll erase it, but for the most part, I can work with this. And I'm going to include some details on here, so when I get to inking, I have some options of keeping. The thing is, I guess the short of it, I don't want to erase reference lines that I may or may not use, and sometimes I refine details in the inking stage. And so maybe that's something I will remove if I know I want it out, but right now I'm going to leave it in there. All right, since we're going kind of full on Star Wars here, and I'll just put in a R2 unit, astromech droid. So this is the snubby version of an X-Wing snub fighter. There we go. Now we're going to go with it and make it work. I try not to make my designs too derivative of things that we know of, but honestly, I've looked at spaceships for so long, my entire life, that design details just sort of filter back in from the back of my mind, and a lot of times I'll see shapes that I might have seen in a Star Trek or Star Wars or Alien movies, sometimes anime shows that I may or may not have watched. There's a lot of good hardware in anime shows, and jet hardware, aircraft hardware. Actually, I'm just kind of fascinated by large mechanical vehicles, so even like boats, for instance, and freighters have some very, very cool shapes. And it's mechanical, you can just kind of go with it. This is all made up anyway. It'll give us a good reference. All right, so now that I'm reasonably happy with it, if I held it straight up, I'm kind of noticing that this guy out here is a little funky, so I will actually now reach for my eraser, and I think that's the one that's throwing the whole thing off. So I'm gonna rekey that one, redraw that one, bring that one in down here. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Distance is good, just the angle is a little off. So that kind of thing is very important, and especially if you are trying to draw an actual X-Wing fighter that has 4 of these, nothing will tell you your perspective is off faster than having those guns in the wrong way. And this one's still a little bit off, but I'm going to go with it just to sort of keep the. I mean, it kind of gives a little bit of dynamic pose for this drawing. You can break the rules a little bit on perspective, but if you go too far, people will notice. Now, at this point, I may erase before getting to the inking, but I'm going to leave this in for right now. And what I'm doing here now is I'm using a number 0.01 micron pen. And I typically go, this is the smallest point that this has. The other kind that I end up using quite frequently is by Pentel. They have a nice line of Technica hybrids, this is a ballpoint, whereas the Micron is more of a felt tip. The ballpoint is really great when you don't actually have to fight with graphite on the page so much. So I'll either erase pretty heavily before using this, or I'll just use these when I do a marker start, which I'll show in a later video. For right now, though, I'm going to go with the felt pen type because this actually kind of goes better over graphite. Graphite gets a little bit of a surface that's a little tricky to draw over sometimes. Now, since this is the finest line piece, I want to establish, basically I want to ink in every major component, and I'm going to be going pretty quick here, but I will actually take my time on this to sort of make sure that some of these details are in and proper. And again, here I have a very X-Wing fighter looking cockpit, and this is the thinnest I have pen-wise right now for the marker. It'd be nice if there was something thinner, but because if this actually does leave a pretty thick line. If you're not careful, it can register as sort of a heavier shadow line. So I try to go thick and thin as much as possible. And you'll see in the next step, I go up to a thicker tipped version to give it a little bit more depth. Because right now, everything I draw is going to basically be in the same, basically the same line width, same line thickness. And like any good inking drawing, you want to be able to establish what's light and dark based on line thickness, and this is pretty black. So I'm just kind of trying to get in all the details in here as much as possible, and you can see I'm rotating my pad as necessary to draw these. The dreaded ellipses. And please, you do not have to keep your drawing pad in one position. I find that it helps and works with your natural arm motion to turn it over, because really, sometimes you'll be fighting with how your hand or arm actually wants to move, and that will affect your drawing quite a bit. So make it easier on yourself. I know that I have a strong left to right straight line, especially if I sort of lock the elbow and shoulder a little bit. A little harder to do on these smaller notepads here than it is on the larger drawing pads, but since we're drawing in tinier detail, I'm left to do more of my wrist, and then I get more off lines like that. Ellipses. So ellipses are tricky. If you don't get them right, of course, you will immediately say, hey, I'm not really sure that that's a circle lying in perspective. So in industrial design school, we used to practice our ellipses quite a bit because you would use them quite frequently for, say, car drawings. Nothing will screw up a drawing faster than having your ellipse off, and this one doesn't even look right. It should be kind of more edge to edge over here, but I'm going to leave it sketchy for now, and maybe later on I'd come back in with a ellipse template and tighten that up. But for the most part, these drawings just supposed to be very fast to get the shape down. They're not intended to be finished drawings at all. They can be taken to the next step and be used for finished drawings, but for this stage, I just want to get a shape, get a concept, get an emotion. Emotion being a ship with character. I want it to have some kind of character. Don't make it just a sort of a straight up blah ship, something that you would look at and go, yeah, I could totally see that would be in a movie, or it denotes speed, or it's tough, or it's a perhaps a luxurious transport. I'm fascinated so much by the idea of having luxury liners in space. It seems like such a silly idea, but it's kind of a fun one, and hopefully I'll live to see the day when such a thing happens, because that would be, you could talk me into a cruise if it goes past the rings of Saturn. It'd certainly talk me into an Alaskan cruise right now, but it hasn't been a priority. Not to knock Alaskan cruises, they look fantastic. Okay, so I kind of had all the major points on here, and I will come back with a thinner marker to add some more detail later. But for right now, I have two other fine line markers, a 0.3 and a 0.5. The 0.5 is thicker, and I think for our benefit it'll show you a bit more of how this is going to work. The 0.5 I'm going to use to add some line weight to basically anything that has a shadow pass underneath it, like say these wings. Now it's skipping over the trying to get that line in there, and now it's skipping over the graphite that I probably should have erased. So maybe I will, you know, I'm feeling it on here too, so maybe I will take a moment and give it an erase. So I am really speeding through this. I will often take more time to nail down the technical details in the pencil version, certainly in these ink versions, but sort of wanted to showcase the process. And by more of these darker lines you add, especially where portions of the design overlap or have some kind of shadow, you'll see you'll add depth and some character to the drawing. It starts to make it really come alive. And in some cases, if there's shadow, there would likely be shadows falling over these engine structures, and back behind here I might actually outline them in some fashion with one of these markers or one of these ink pens, but for right now I'm going to leave that alone. And I'm thinking these channels up here have a little bit of depth, so I'm going to give them a little bit of depth here by sort of thickening their lines in our R2 unit. One of those flat-headed R5D4 types. Give them a little bit more there and add some greeley material in here. These kinds of Star Wars fighters had what looked like old transmissions and other bits of catalytic converters, whatever they could find in the parts department for the full-size models, and whatever they can find in the parts department of model kits in the scale models. Quite literally transmissions. Makes it busy, makes it look mean, makes it look fast. Alrighty. Okay, so that's really about as far, I mean, I would probably, about as far as I'm going to go with this piece. I'm going to go back down to, actually I think I'm going to 0.3. An important other piece is that these surfaces I've left on here are kind of flat, so to give them some sense of detail, I am going to go back down to my 0.1. Yeah, they're made up of, when I'm thinking about ships, they're often made up of these panels. Maybe they're armored panels or they're covers of some kind, but they're not usually one singular piece, and they're not 4x8 sheets of plywood unless you look at the live models. But adding some kind of detail and little hatches, little other bits of stuff on here does a couple of things. One, it kind of gives it life, and it helps define the shape a bit more before going to a shading phase. So I'm going to add little bits on here. Anything that would kind of give it a sense of scale, especially if you do something kind of recognizable. Like if I actually put like a ladder rung in here of some kind for a pilot, or maybe that's just the pilot's name and there's actually some no step warnings, things like that. I mean, this is all a visual language that you would get if you happen to be wandering around an airport or around aircraft, but it did actually seem to feed into the look and feel of a lot of these Star Wars ships, and let's face it, airports are cool. Alrighty. And we have basically a decent line drawing, so the next phase, and I'm going to actually remove some of the pencil inside of this drawing so that I don't really, a couple of things. I could see if I've actually need to add any more ink before going to a marker, and second, when I do add marker on this, it'll have a tendency to pick up some of the graphite and smear, which may or may not be what you're going for. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove some from the inside, and I even left some of the, it might be too light to see, but I left some of the perspective grids in here. That's okay. It looks like it's holding up pretty well. So now I'm going to start with a fairly light marker. This is by Barrel Prismacolor. This is a 20% gray. It's also a very dry 20% gray. These markers, like many other markers, you can use Copic, you can use Chart Pack, it doesn't really matter. This marker has two ends. There's a thin end and a thicker end that sort of has a multifaceted shape to it of questionable geometry. I'm old school, I like just the flat ones, but this will work out fine. So now I start with the lightest one just to lay in where I think the shadows are going to be. And I do this with the lightest one so that if I do make a mistake, it's actually, I mean, at this point you aren't erasing with marker. You're going in with marker. It's going to be there. So I'm using this to sort of start in the forms. And in my mind, the light's kind of coming from the top left hitting this. So we're going to have shadow zones on the sides here facing us, the viewer. And most of the inside of these intakes is going to be dark, but I'll darken them up anyway, leaving a little bit here. And this just follows the same rules you'd expect from any kind of drawing, where you'd denote light, shadow, highlights, and so forth. But instead of doing it with color, we're going to do it with a sort of a light gray. Now I'm kind of adding a little wisp of gray as the marker dries out, a little bit more to the edges because my paper's white. And it does kind of help pull it away from the paper a little bit when there's a little bit of a tone here. But for the most part, this is drawing on the edges like this can really flatten your image. So go lightly. I'm going very lightly. So now, got a little 20% in here. Let's bump it up to the other marker that I have, my Barrel Prismacolor 40. Maybe a little bit too much of a jump. If you've got really wet markers, you're going to notice a pretty good jump, so you might want to go 30. It's entirely up to you. Some people may even want to go darker at this point, but I like to work up from the lighter to the darker. I feel like I got a little bit more control of that. And we're just doing the same thing. We're darkening up shadow zones. Since this is rolling up, I think the shadow would be kind of towards the middle, and there would be a little bit of reflected light from the bottom. You get this little nose bit in here, and I'm not going to work the cockpit yet. I'm going to sort of leave that alone, but importantly enough, this back end here, I'm going to fill this straight in because I do want this to be a little darker. I'll add some more shadows with darker pieces there too. Same thing with these turkey feather wing exhausts, and I should have done this over here, but I was going to leave a little highlight there, which, you know, coming over it again, you can, a lighter pass will leave a little bit hint of that. And since I'm getting into the thin territory, I'm going to switch to the thin side. Yep, and note I have no straight edge. I'm just basically working this with freehand and letting the mistakes be mistakes. The goal here is just to have a design, just to have a shape that can make you go wow and see if it's something that would possibly work for a next phase, whether you're working on a game or a movie or book cover, for instance. That can just be anything. Now, unfortunately, I would jump to the 60 or 70%, but my markers are pretty much dead. Some of these are 20-year-old markers that I happen to find, and they have worked remarkably well for my Spaceship a Day exercises, but they're rapidly dying. So now I'm going to jump up to the 90, which is almost black. And this is an old version of the same marker. In fact, this one has the flatter edges that I was referring to. So if you compare the tips on these, they're sort of it's kind of hard to see maybe with a light, but this one's a little more rounded. This one's a little bit more flat. Kind of like the flat, just because I sort of knew where I was going with it. But it's just a practice thing. As I get used to the other tips again, it'll be fine. Strangely enough, the Chart Pack ad markers I had typically used in college for industrial design had a similar tip, but I don't know, for some reason those just worked in my hand better than these do. So now I'm going in with a very dark with this 90 and making sure that I get some of the darker details in here, which would be the back inside these inlets, and I kind of just flatten that out a little bit. Really, you want to make this look like the inside of a cylinder, but my tendency is often to go too light, and I noticed that in some of my drawings before, so I'm trying to make a point of getting a darker view in here. So now with the windows, this is mainly going to be a reflection, and reflections, you know, glass, tend to be I know there's a whole art and science to that, so I would encourage you to go practice some reflections. And sorry about that, bumped everything. So I don't leave it completely black. You're kind of going to get basically a truncated shot of what the horizon would be here, but since we don't really have a horizon in space, it's just really a visual metaphor. There we go. And I may go back in and add more details around some of these pieces, but for the most part, that's done, and that's my spaceship a day. Thanks for watching.